Efi and the team. It's a great honor for me to be here, especially when I was a PhD student. Jim's and Daron's work was a very big inspiration for all PhD students at the time who were taking this view that economic development doesn't simply come from investment, from infrastructure, perhaps from skills, but it also comes because from the underlying power, political power of the society and the institutions at place. So let me start with the two questions that I think plague and characterize the Greek society. What is going to be next? But this is closely related to a question that we have not answered, which regards why this thing happened. And I think that if we are to come up with a solution for the future, we better start understanding what happened in the past because the two are interlinked. Let me not, everybody, likes economists to give stats. Let me not give you the stats of the Greek crisis, but let me just tell you that now Greece is the fourth poorest EU member country. It used to be somewhere in the middle with an upward trajectory. Now it's like the fourth poorest. And you don't need statistics. You can see pictures of homeless, of people living actually in upper middle class neighborhood downtown Athens, collecting food from garbages. You have like dreams draining. So they're like, and on top of that, you have a humanitarian crisis. So the why, I think it is still unanswered because for a typical Greek situation, there's a lot of animosity and political debate on what led us here. There's also noise from the media. And also there is a lot of fighting, if you like. Now, in my view, in economics, there have been, roughly speaking, 4 readings of the Greek crisis. The first, let me call it the German, if you like, view, is that the Greeks had their party, and effectively it was hangover time. And what is crucial is that if you buy this story, the key problem was debt, was the excessive fiscal deficits. So therefore, any correction had to start from some form of fiscal sustainability. Then you had like a view coming mostly from US-based so-called neo-Keynesian economists who thought that, look, actually fiscal policy should have been actually accommodative during the crisis rather than actually cutting expenditure and raising taxes. Third, like the more recent incarnation, was that this whole doom loop between banks and sovereigns. And as the previous session with the 3 Georges highlighted, there was also this fourth reading that perhaps the problem is on the competitiveness. It's the fact that, jumping on Jim's remark, Greek firms do not actually patent many things. There's not much innovation or entrepreneurship. Now, depending on which story you buy, as typical in the Greek society, there was a blame game. So who was to put the blame? The politicians, the old politicians. Now people accuse the new politicians. The banks giving excessive loans, the media. Perhaps, you were now, during the crisis, we started accusing the foreigners. Perhaps there was a bad design of the euro. Perhaps the Troika and the IMF, the various EU member counters, the ECB, played a negative role. However, my reading of the crisis is that no matter which story you buy, the fiscal profligacy, the fiscal policy during the crisis, or the problems in banks, or the competitiveness, effectively, you are looking at outcomes. What lies at the root are the extremely dysfunctional and clientistic Greek institutions. So the debt, the very high levels of debt, or actually, as George Kouliarakis pointed out, Greece had like this habit of running excessive fiscal deficits. Actually, these effectively are the symptoms of the problem. And what lies at the core was an inefficient public administration, inefficient regulations, extremely inefficient and corrupt courts, and much more generally what Jim and Daron coined in their book as extractive institutions. Perhaps not Mugabe style, but something perhaps more similar to Mexico or Colombia style. So what I tend to believe, and actually that's a quote from my favorite movie, the Casablanca, a sigh is just a sigh, the fundamental things apply as time goes by. I think that at the core, one needs to understand the fundamentals. And institutions, and here I give some institutions, property rights, legal institutions, checks and balances on the executive, corporate governance, which is something that we don't talk at all, I think, in Greece, red tape, these lie at the core of the problem. And if you were to go a bit deeper, of course, you have the political system, and here political system reflecting not only politicians, but the civil society as well, being at the root of this issue. And I think that if we are to look in the future, we need to address those pathologies. Let me give just one example. So if one was to summarize, in my view, the Greek crisis, let me just show you only one graph. This is a scatter plot of GDP per capita, a measure of economic success, if you like, perhaps a poor one, but a decent, but this is what most people would use, plotted against an index of investor protection. How well you protect shareholders, for example, and creditors for their investment. We had a great session on venture capital investment. You need to protect those people who are putting their money. Well, Greece is an immense outlier in the sense that before the crisis, the level of income, of the wealth, if you like, of well-being of Greece was way higher than as compared to what you would have expected with a very simple linear association. So, which tells you that, look, perhaps the problem you just see during the crisis, if you like, a correction. So Greece just falls to what you should have predicted, given the poor institutional capacity of the Greek state. For example, this is the measure I mentioned earlier. This is a measure of shareholders' rights. It was abysmally low, way lower than other European Union member countries. You can look at inefficiency in the court system, which together with other Southern European countries, Greece was scoring very, very low. And actually, perhaps related to this issue, you have a very limited penetration of information technology here on the justice system, but this applies much more generally in the Greek state. Given the short time, let me just mention that this was an issue that characterized other countries of the European periphery. And if anything, in the booming years, institutional quality and state capacity in Greece and the other countries of the European periphery were somewhat deteriorating. Which is interesting because typically those indicators have been accused of reflecting development. Actually, when Greece was doing well, actually you could have spotted perhaps some weaknesses emerging there. Now, sadly enough, time goes by, and Greece had to sign 3 memorandum of understandings and associated economic adjustment programs, which had a huge focus on the fiscal conditions, which truly were important. There were some effort to correct trade imbalances, although sadly enough, the correction of the trade deficit came mostly because Greeks consume now less from what is produced outside the world, rather than by increasing Greek exports. Now, what is perhaps interesting is that if you now go post-crisis, so in 2014, or if you like here in 2016, Greece's institutions, so this is the measure of inefficiencies in courts, actually, if anything, they have deteriorated. So this gives you the days that it takes to process a simple standardized dispute through the Greek judicial system. Recall, Greece was a bit scoring better than Italy and Cyprus. Now it scores way worse. The same applies when one is to look at the bankruptcy, which is another actually quite important aspect if you are an investor. So Greek investors who possess collateral get only something like 30 cents on the euro, way lower than in other comparable countries. So I think we need to reflect why institutional reform has to a first approximation failed. And here I give my view. I think a significant barrier was the lack of ownership. Institutional reforms were imposed or were seen to be imposed by foreigners. There was powerful insiders like the Carlos Slim example, both coming from the super rich, but also coming from vested interests that opposed those reforms. At the same time, reforms coincided with austerity. So now if I go to my friends or cousins in Greece and tell them about institutional reform, they would immediately think that I want to tax them, which is actually quite important. A lot of those reforms were actually quickly done to meet, another closing, if you like, of the various MOUs that were signed. So in a nutshell, institutional reform, although significant things have taken place, I think it's fair to say that it has failed. So what next? So, Greeks tend to have like extremely polar views. So either some are like super bullish, some people are very bearish. But actually what I observe is that a lot of passiveness, if you like, of that. So, we all sit in a cafeteria, we discuss, and we're either bullish or passive, but without doing much. And I think what is great, by the way, since, I'm not number 7 in Reload Greece, but I think I'm one of the first ones, is that, let's act. And this I have like 2 quotes from Muhammad Ali: don't count the days, make the days count. Or, the best way to make your dreams come true is to act. So I think that what Greece has to do, and actually there's no better audience than this one, is to think about what we can do about this country. And I think what Greece needs is another, if you like, a bailout program. You may think, what is another bailout program? And I think Greece needs a fourth bailout program that will involve the Greek society, civil society, perhaps political parties in the parliament, that it is an institutional bailout. We have had 3 bailouts looking on fiscal policy, as George pointed out, important, about correcting trade imbalances, important, but I think that those, if you like, are the symptoms rather than the deep cause. And I think we need an institutional bailout that will come from Greeks of the diaspora, from Greek entrepreneurs, from Greek bankers, from the Greek people. And I think that we need to have the following, it should touch the following areas: the judiciary, legal institutions, public administration, corporate governance, regulation. It has to cover all areas. And why is that? And let me actually conclude with this insight. So this is a typical slide that perhaps Jim and I use when we teach poverty traps. The idea there is that in poor societies, you need to make huge interventions, because if you make small, marginal interventions, those will not last. And one of the issues that the Greek crisis teaches us is that small interventions, if you try to a bit improve here or a bit improve there, they will not have a big effect because there are strong complementarities. Actually, the reason why the public administration is dysfunctional is because administrative courts are dysfunctional. And the reason why administrative courts are dysfunctional is because we lack IT in the public sector more generally. So you need, if you like, this was the famous quote of development economists in the 50s and the 60s, a big push. With some common principles that IT has to be there, it should involve the Greek society, it will need to have some international support. And you may say that this is perhaps a mirage, it will be something that will never happen. But let me just conclude, I'll just put them there so you see them. There have been many countries with very similar deep causes like the one that the Greek economy is being faced. Hong Kong actually is a very good example. They established an independent commission to tackle corruption. Not overnight, but in a period of 10 years, they have managed to take Hong Kong, a country which international scored extremely high on corruption, to be one of the least corrupt countries in the world. What do you need for that? Actually, a very good example comes from India. When Raghu Rajan, perhaps the most prolific Indian economist, went from the University of Chicago actually back to India, before he became the governor of the central bank, he authored a report about the Indian financial system, with the very nice title, 100 Small Steps. I think we need 100 small steps about the Greek telecom, about the Greek banking system, about administrative courts, about civil courts. And then you blend them all together, and you can have like this exodus, if you like, from the poverty trap, the institutional poverty trap equilibrium that characterizes it. Estonia, Georgia, countries that were under communism for decades have managed to do that. So it is not impossible. Thank you very much.